it is not merely those who fight who suffer from the fighting. The innocent, our village, the very land beneath our feet, it is all things which suffer. I wish to be stronger. Strong enough to protect all. What have I, who am called the Maid of Orleans, accomplished hitherto? I have stumbled blindly from one battle to the next, saving no one. But the hand which pulled me from that frigid dungeon showed me the way. It is not victory or glory which liberates people from despair. It is the warmth of a helping hand. From this day on, I shall be that hand. To those who suffer, wherever they may be.
So probably lower down my list of things anti-SJWs would actually care about is, I guess, female saints from the 15th century. So today we're going to be talking about Joan of Arc, and in a new play in London at the Globe Theatre, Joan of Arc is going to be depicted as non-binary. And if you know anything about Joan of Arc and the history of Joan of Arc and like the crimes she was charged with, you would feel like out of all the historical characters, this isn't really a bad choice for this interesting take on this person. But of course, it has set a lot of people into a frenzy. How dare they depict Joan of Arc this way? Not that Joan of Arc has been depicted in theatre, film, books and everything so many times that I feel like this sort of variety is fine because you're just spicing things up. One of the most famous silent movies is of Joan of Arc. You have like Luc Besson's Joan of Arc film. You have Shakespeare plays like actually written by Shakespeare and performed while he was alive with Joan of Arc as a character. Who really cares if in this one play she is non-binary? And as we're going to talk about in the video, she is an interesting character to depict as non-binary just because the charges for which she was convicted and sentenced to death were about wearing men's clothes and like challenging these gender norms in, of course, a medieval patriarchy. So you feel like there could be an interesting story there. And of course, JK Rowling is kind of involved in this in some way. But what is interesting is I've wanted to actually make a video on Joan of Arc for a while. I did a whole module in university during my history degree on Joan of Arc. And the thing I wanted to focus on was Joan of Arc's role in far-right French politics. And this goes all the way back to the Vichy French government, that is of course embodied by Le Pen today. It's actually a big thing for her to visit the shrine to Joan of Arc every single year. There's been a big cult around Joan of Arc in France for years, which eventually led to her being canonized in 1920. But she's also been a symbol for the French army in World War I, also a symbol for the Free French in World War II, for communist movements in France, but more so the far right have adopted her in France today. And that's what I want to focus on because I feel like it's more interesting and it's what I wanted to originally make the video on anyway. And I think it's quite fitting that far-right conservatives in America and in Europe who are now crying about non-binary Joan of Arc are really carrying on the legacy of Joan of Arc being like this symbol for far-right movements. So all of that coming up for you today, but before we go any further, please like the video, and I guess for the comments, I can't really think of anything today. I guess I'm curious, what is the weirdest thing you've seen anti-SJW nerd channels get outraged about? I think Joan of Arc must be one of the weirder ones, especially Americans. Like, if you're not a Catholic, how much are you taught about the 100 Years' War and Joan of Arc in American school? I know we're taught about it in England a lot because it has like a big legacy here. Let me know down in the comments anyway. Follow me on social media at the Kavernacle, on Twitter, on Instagram. Check out my second channel. Check out the subreddit in the description. Also consider becoming a patron. I want to build up as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible. And the benefits of that are getting access to the Discord server and my Nintendo Switch friend code. And when I move to Vietnam at the start of next month, I'm hoping to upload some more exclusive content. Won't be anything like that special, just stuff from my phone, either showing you Vietnam or talking about my experiences there. So if you care about any of that, consider becoming a patron. So to start with, I want to get into the drama around non-binary Joan of Arc and the backlash by anti-SJW nerd channels, and how stupid it is that they are suddenly pretending to care about women. Like, seriously, people like The Quartering and Ryan Kinnell now pretending they care about women, despite like half of their content being like criticizing women's roles in prominent films, is pretty laughable. And they're essentially taking the language of turfy liberal feminism in the UK, pretending they care about depictions of women. So let's get into the backlash. So there's a Daily Mail article, and obviously you guys will know it's like a total garbage outlet. But a lot of the time, for SEO purposes, they just write these massive articles, and I feel like it's good just to showcase like the whole drama, although obviously I know this paper is actually trying to drum up hatred around this. Thankfully, me reading it to you means they're not getting any like ad revenue off this or anything. And I love stuff like this just really upsetting the worst people. It's totally worth creating a non-binary Joan of Arc just to really annoy these types. So JK Rowling has ridiculed the Globe Theatre's portrayal of Joan of Arc as non-binary after women's rights campaigners said the switch was insulting and damaging. The Mail Online's exclusive yesterday on Shakespeare's Globe Theatre's new portrayal of Joan of Arc as non-binary has sparked extensive backlash from feminists. Yes, I'm sure the real feminists are really mad, and historians. Mrs. Rowling's entry to the debate was the lightest of touches. It will be seen as hugely significant supporters of her views and causes. It came after a Twitter user criticised the Globe's new I, Joan production. Her remark of coming next, Napoleon was a woman because he was defeated at Waterloo, was liked by JK Rowling on social media. It came moments after Heather Binning from Women's Rights Network told Mail Online that the play was damaging to women. And I probably don't even need to look up the Women's Rights Network to probably understand it's like a liberal feminist organisation in the UK, meaning it is probably pretty turfy. So she says, this demonstrates just how our arts and creative industries have taken on the woke mantle. Okay, prove my point already. Without realising that being kind to one group of people actually hurts and damages another important and fundamental group. Joan of Arc was female. Her early years were spent cooking and cleaning and looking after animals. When she was 10, she had a vision that she was to fight for France. In order to do this, she took on the outward appearance of being male. This had nothing to do with feelings and everything to do with the biological reality and disadvantage that being female brought. Many women throughout the ages have had to adopt maleness in order to be taken seriously and advance their ambition. To rewrite female history is an insult. Using they-them pronouns for an individual is grammatically incorrect and ugly and confusing to many in society who struggle with language. Yes, it's so confusing. You've never referred to someone as they or them in your life, I'm sure. Again, some of the worst supposed liberal feminists, who are really far-right feminists, getting mad. Dr. Sarah Rutherford has said, the idea the historical heroine could be non-binary was insulting. This offends me. Joan of Arc is a female cultural icon. She was escaping the constraints of being a woman at the time. Non-binary, I've been told, means neither male or female. We know she was a woman. Please stop applying a modern, nonsensical ideology to historical figures. And I do laugh these people think that being non-binary or being androgynous or being transgender is some sort of a modern invention. So some terrible MPs in the UK have also spoke about this. Anne Widdecombe, former Tory MP and Catholic herself, told the Mail Online, holy figures in religion should be treated with respect. It is insulting when people play around with the saints just because they want to make some kind of point. It's a farce beyond measure. Joan of Arc was a woman. There is no evidence she thought of herself in any other way. She was a woman. How on earth someone could suggest she was non-binary is beyond me. This play is effectively dewomanizing her. They are effectively rewriting history. I think she would have laughed at it in utter scorn, while Shakespeare would have clutched his head in disbelief. Yeah, Shakespeare and his plays, which saw men playing all the female characters and probably playing Joan of Arc. I'm sure Shakespeare would have clutched his head in disbelief. So you can understand there's loads of backlash like that. Who really cares? It's actually quite funny just to bore the piss of these people. But the director of I, Joan has written something lengthy on the Globe's website, and I thought I would read some of it with you. So Michelle Terry, Shakespeare's Globe proudly presents a new play, I, Joan, with Joan as a legendary leader, who in this production uses the pronouns they, them. The production opens on the 25th of August in the open-air Globe Theatre. We are not the first to present Joan in this way, and we will not be the last. Regarding the use of pronouns, they to refer to a singular person has been traced by the Oxford Dictionary to as early as 1375, years before Joan was even born. Regardless, theatres do not deal with historical reality. Theatres produce plays, and in plays, anything can be possible. Shakespeare did not write historically accurate plays. He took figures of the past to ask questions about the world around him. Our writers of today are doing no different, whether that's looking at Anne Boleyn, Edward II, or Joan of Arc. The Globe is a place of imagination, a place where, for a brief amount of time, we can at least consider the possibility of worlds elsewhere. We have had entire storms take place on stage, the sinking of ships, twins who look nothing alike being believable, and even the Queen of the Fairies falling in love with a donkey. So this is getting to my point as well. For centuries, Joan has been a cultural icon, portrayed in countless plays, books, and films. History has provided countless and wonderful examples of Joan portrayed as a woman. This production is simply offering the possibility of another point of view. That is the role of theatre, to simply ask the question, imagine if. So in the past century, Joan has come to be, for many, a feminist and queer icon, with Vita Sackville-West first putting forth speculation about Joan's sexuality in her 1936 biography, St. Joan of Arc. Sackville-West's work was instantly met with critique, as not all her speculations are historically grounded. For example, her focus on Joan supposedly sharing a bed with women fails to acknowledge that this was commonplace at the time. However, Sackville-West's St. Joan represents a landmark moment in queer history, and it's undeniable that Joan's refusal to conform to medieval conceptions of female propriety and the persecution they suffered due to their preference for traditionally male clothing have contributed to Joan's legacy as the essence of transgressive androgyny. So before we get into the YouTuber reaction, just to shed some light onto Joan of Arc a bit more and what she was charged with. So just on Wikipedia, just to give a brief summary. For the time of her journey to Chinon to her abjuration, Joan usually wore men's clothes. She cropped her hair in a male fashion. She was said to have worn a black doublet, a black tunic, and a short black cap. By the time she was captured, she had acquired a more elaborate outfit. During her trial, she is not recorded as given a practical reason why she cross-dressed. She stated that it was her own choice to wear men's clothes, and that she did not at the request of men, but by the command of God and the angels. She stated that she would return to wearing women's clothes when she fulfilled her calling. Her cross-dressing became one of the principal articles in her accusations at the trial. In the view of her assessors, it was the emblem of her heresy. Joan's final condemnation began when she was found to have resumed wearing men's clothes, which was taken as an overt sign that she had relapsed by obeying her visions again. For most of her active life, Joan of Arc did not cross-dress to hide her gender. Rather, it may have functioned to emphasize her unique identity as La Pucelle, a model of virtue that transcends gender roles and inspires people. So many plays in the theatres change up stuff about historical figures. Like the cast of Hamilton has always been really diverse. Despite depicting pretty much exclusively white historical characters, there's been loads of Shakespeare plays where they've changed up the race of certain characters as well. And I don't know why these people see it as erasing history. I could only understand that argument if Joan of Arc's story had never been told before or something like that, whereas Joan of Arc is pretty much one of the most famous women in Western history, like I said, depicted in so many really famous films and a really famous silent movie, literally one of the most famous silent movies starred Joan of Arc, so many books, and he's a national hero in France. People won't see I, Joan and suddenly think Joan of Arc was non-binary, although I read you the cross-dressing part and how that factored into her trial and her death, and you might think yourself, well, that's just an interesting angle to tackle Joan of Arc because, like it said, she was never hiding her identity. She literally went to meet King Charles and never pretended to be a man. When she was with the Armagnac forces in battle, she wasn't pretending to be a man. She wasn't hiding. It's not like Eowyn in Lord of the Rings, where she's pretending to be a man. Joan of Arc was very visible in battle. There is no history that Joan of Arc ever actually killed people in battle. She always just went in with her banner to inspire the troops, but she was never hiding. And that's why she had such prominence. She was not cross-dressing for the purpose of hiding her identity as just another male soldier, as a lot of these people crying about, I don't know, historical erasure are talking about. She didn't necessarily have to dress this way, so it really puts holes in some of their arguments. But yeah, a female hero really challenging gender norms in a time where the patriarchy had never been so strong due to this like Christian dominance of Europe as well. I think that's an interesting conversation, and just, you know, as a one-off play where Joan of Arc is a non-binary character, I think that's fine. I think it could be interesting. Do you guys just want the retelling of Joan of Arc's story as accurate as possible every time you see it? If you've seen Luc Besson's film, you know that's not historically accurate. If you play the Koei Tecmo game Blade Storm, Joan of Arc is a playable character. Joan of Arc is wearing these massive armor with flowing long hair. If you play Warriors Orochi, a spin-off of like Dynasty Warriors and Samurai Warriors, you can fight of Joan of Arc. And if you played the Blade Storm remaster on PS4, Joan of Arc is literally possessed by a demon, and her cleavage is on show where she wears this demonic outfit and she's the main villain of the game. I reckon these people are crying about historical accuracy when Joan of Arc pops up in Blade Storm Nightmares campaign. On that note, that game is actually very good. I played both versions of it on the PS3 and PS4. I would very much recommend it. It's set during the 100 Years' War, and although it looks like Dynasty Warriors, it has far more tactics on it, and it's all about controlling individual units. Very good game. Now, getting into the anti-SJW reaction to this, we've already seen the liberal TERF feminist reaction to this. This makes me laugh, because let me know in the comments, are you taught about the 100 Years' War in school? Like, apparently there are statues to Rollo, the first Duke of Normandy in America, I've read somewhere, right? And the roots of the 100 Years' War can be traced back to William the Conqueror, who was also the Duke of Normandy, who became the King of England. And because he became the King of England, a version of French became the language of the English aristocracy. The royal bloodlines became more intertwined, meaning that the descendants of William often had claim to the French throne and had claim to French lands, like Edward III did, and when he invaded parts of France, that kicked off the 100 Years' War. Joan of Arc arises when it becomes more of a civil war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, who are in bed with the English. I can't see Jeremy from The Quartering and Ryan Kinnell as massive history buffs who love Joan of Arc so much that this actually outrages them. But let's get into both of their reactions.
The erasure or diminishment of women has been something that's been really popular on the left for the last year or two. Whether it's allowing biological men to compete against biological women and take spots away from them on trophy podiums and scholarships and in media headlines, or it's, you know, the general erasure of the values that traditional women have, the erasure of the biology, the biological facts of what make a woman. We've even had Wikipedia and Merriam-Webster dictionaries update their definition of what a woman is to modern woke speak. And now JK Rowling is out there absolutely destroying the new Joan of Arc play, because Joan of Arc is being depicted as non-binary with they and them pronouns.
Play the game of identity politics, especially in the entertainment industry. There is no finish line. There is no end game. It will never be woke enough. It will never be diverse enough. People will just keep pressing for more and more until it gets so progressive that no one's watching this anymore. And we're at the point in the industry where people are taking actual stories of female empowerment, stories about truly strong female characters, even ones from history that women, look up to this very day. And people are trying to change it because it's not progressive enough. That's why we have ridiculous headlines like this. Joan of Arc cast as gender neutral with they them pronouns. This is laughable, and I imagine a lot of people have a very big problem with this, especially if Joan of Arc is a Catholic saint, right? Achieved sainthood. The reason this story is important is because Joan of Arc is a woman. That's why this story is so special. And by changing this person into a make-believe, they-them, non-binary person completely eliminates all of that.
So both these two are apparently both massive history buffs for medieval history, which I could believe a bit more, but they're also massive theatre buffs. They really care about what's showing at the Globe Theatre in London where hardly anyone will probably ever see this play. It's totally ridiculous and just so funny. Like, I'm thinking about like the comment section, which is really angry as well, and I'm thinking about all these people just getting really riled up about non-binary Joan of Arc in like a one play in London, not even the country where she is like most venerated, and actually caring about this. Maybe if it was like a big budget movie starring like a massive star, I'd understand it a bit more, although obviously I wouldn't agree because it's more visible. But this is such a niche thing. It's obviously them just spinning it into part of this culture war. And like I already outlined, if you're going to choose a character from history to maybe depict as non-binary, I think Joan of Arc is actually a very good choice because you can make a commentary on society, like the director of the show said, and you can also just ask interesting questions about Joan of Arc, gender norms in medieval times, and why she actually presented herself in a more masculine way. Of course, I don't think these far-right anti-SJWs, like the Courtney and Ryan Kinnell, know anything about Joan of Arc in terms of history. I'd be surprised if they actually knew anything beyond, I don't know, saying that Joan of Arc kicked the English out of France, which she didn't even do because she died long before they were actually kicked out and the Burgundians switched sides and turned against them. But they're following a long tradition of the far right simping over Joan of Arc. And like I said before, she's always been a pretty politicized symbol in France, whether that's been the various French revolutions, World War I or World War II. And on the surface, it's very easy to see the two versions of Joan of Arc. So for the left wing in France, what does Joan of Arc represent? Resisting invasion, resisting oppression, resisting, I guess, foreign domination from an occupying power. And you can see why that might apply to World War I when Germany invaded France. You can see why it applied to World War II when Germany occupied France with the Vichy French government. Of course, they probably saw them like the Burgundians. But for the far right, it's also easy to see what she represented. She is kicking out foreign influence and their collaborators from France to make France for French people. Like, get rid of those English, get rid of the Burgundians, get rid of all these elements which will subvert the French kingdom. That's just like a very surface level reading of Joan of Arc. Now, I want to get into more detail now because I have two really good articles about this. First, I want to talk about her competing role between the Free French and Vichy France before talking about the contemporary far right in France and how they use Joan of Arc. So if you guys haven't heard the term Vichy before, the Vichy government are essentially just the Germans' puppet government in France. So the Vichy government, over which Pétain presided and which Laval tended to run, was meant to stand for French values distinct from those of the Republic it had replaced. Vichy's motto was the cozy, work, home, country. Before the war, Pétain approved of the conservative movements that defended the family, and like many on the right, he linked attachment to the family with attachment to the soil. When Rouen celebrated Joan's 5th centenary in 1931, he wrote, "Joan of Arc incarnates patriotism in its most complete sense. Her great lesson to her own and his fellow countrymen was unity in the service of a country. In 1940, his role would be to foster such unity." In the First World War, Joan's image had been used to politically attack the Germans for bombarding Reims and damaging the cathedral where Charles VII had been crowned King of France. In the Second World War, the bombing of Rouen was marked by a poster in which a huge figure of Joan wrings her hands over the city where the English had betrayed her twice. On the 13th of May 1944, a series of posters and stickers appeared with the text, "So that France may live like Joan of Arc, we must kick the English out of Europe." When D-Day came, the Marshal spoke of an invasion of the country, and the Free French who joined in the invasion were cast in the role of the modern Burgundians. Like I was saying earlier, Pétain was too senile to note the paradox that Vichy's Joan was the saint as collaborator. In exile at the Connaught Hotel in London, Charles de Gaulle received visitors sitting under portraits of Joan of Arc and Napoleon. At his first meeting with President Roosevelt, he gave the president a lecture on his vision of French history, describing inspiring people since Charlemagne who had come to the nation's rescue, such as Joan of Arc, Napoleon. This convinced Roosevelt that de Gaulle was a megalomaniac. He joked that de Gaulle believed that he himself was Joan, a joke the general did not find amusing and never forgave. It was not only because of a portrait that de Gaulle kept Joan in mind in London. He also referred to her in many of his speeches. On the 2nd of July 1940, she was one of that dauntless band who would never have agreed to the surrender of all the arms of France to their enemies, so that the enemies could use them against her allies. This was a theme he returned to over and over again in the early years of the war. In 1940, the crisis of 1429 had returned. France will recover its sense of national unity, as in the age of Joan of Arc and in the age of revolution. De Gaulle saved for 10th of May 1942, the eve of Joan of Arc's feast, a speech exclusively devoted to her, and he said, "Our meeting is the proof of our hope. We all think today that if 500 years ago France discovered in herself, at Joan of Arc's call, the flame needed for her salvation, today she can also rediscover the same flame. We wish only to join together our minds and our hearts in unshakable confidence in the destiny of eternal France." So just before we talk about this article a bit more, it ends with, "The one political party to stick by Joan of Arc is the party of the far right, the Front National, led by Jean-Marie Le Pen. Le Pen is no thug like the leaders of the British National Party. He is versed in the tradition for which he stands. He is a demagogue with honed rhetorical skills. Every May 1st, members of the FN have a meeting. These meetings are the only political rallies in modern France that invoke the spirit of Joan of Arc. Le Pen's addresses begin evocation of Joan's remarkable life before he launches into an attack on the euro, the EU, immigration, and the erosion of French sovereignty." So just a little side note there, although I spoke about the communist use of Joan of Arc, Charles de Gaulle is not a communist. He was a hard right colonialist, but it's interesting the contrasting images of how he used Joan of Arc and how the Vichy far right government of France used Joan of Arc. And it's interesting because, like many national myths, you can kind of project what you want on these figures. It happens in many European countries. The political parties in power, if they play into nationalism, can project what they really want on these figures, especially when the history is so far removed. And Joan of Arc has a lot about her that can feed into both types of left and right ideologies. I would say personally, I feel like she lends herself more to right-wing ideologies just because she is a Catholic saint and she does most things in the name of God. I want to get more into the Front National, Le Pen, and obviously Marine Le Pen, who is the daughter of Jean Le Pen, and just talk about how they used mythology around Joan of Arc and how they use her image, kind of constructed by the Vichy, to really push their xenophobic far-right agenda in France. So this article from the University of Minnesota Press by Dimitra Dimitriou, Myth and the Rise of the Global Right, Amazons vs. Joan of Arc. So in the early 1980s, the Front National introduced in its arsenal the figure of Joan of Arc as a symbol of nationhood, ancestral heritage, Catholic devotion, and national pride. Since 1988, the FN has held its annual march on May Day to honour Joan of Arc, holding much publicised events to commemorate the occasion. The party and founder and former president Jean-Marie Le Pen was not the first to see in La Pucelle a symbol of an age-old culture and an emblem of patriotism. The FN's Joan of Arc gradually came to stand for a particular kind of nationalism, as former FN deputy Bruno Maigret writes in National Hebdo, "Joan of Arc is there to tell us that we belong to a community of our own, which is different from that of other people, and of which we ought to be proud because it belongs to us and our ancestors." Along similar lines, in Jean-Marie Le Pen's 2017 May Day speech, Joan of Arc marks the contours of the French nation as an organic, homogeneous entity, as against an unspeakable alterity that appears to prey on France. For FN's idolatry of Joan of Arc is based upon two main sentiments. First, the idea that Joan personifies France and French virtues, and second, the rather presumptuous notion widely held within the party that Le Pen and Joan share common philosophical ground in as much as both in their differing eras have sought the cleansing and purification of France. According to this line of thought, there are similarities between Joan's mission to expel the English from French soil and Le Pen's contemporary campaign to rid France of its North African immigrant population. Like Joan, Marine Le Pen's task of saving France acquires a Christic vocation that, however secularized, is genuinely spiritual and emotionally charged. In this respect, Marine Le Pen does not simply invoke Joan of Arc, she is Joan of Arc. Accordingly, Joan's voices become vox or dictum populi, and ordinary people are invited to recognize themselves in Marine, under the illusion of being the true source of authority. So it's interesting to see the kind of enduring legacy of Joan of Arc in mainstream French politics is one of xenophobia, and as the article said, purifying France. And under the Vichy, it was kicking out the English, was making sure the D-Day landings and the invasions did not succeed. And now we transition to the 2010s, where for the Le Pen, it's all about othering people. It's all about trying to get rid of the North African immigrant communities in places like Paris. Obviously, this connection forged through France's own brutal colonialism. I'm sure the irony isn't lost on a lot of people there. And how they've taken this mythology of her as the saviour of the French nation, or even helping to construct the French nation in the first place, has really played into their hands. And like I said, you can just project kind of what you want on Joan of Arc in times of crisis. So World War I, World War II, it's pretty obvious for people. But then in times of like economic crises or manufactured crises like the far right often like to create, you can depict yourself, like Le Pen does, as Joan of Arc, fighting either the European Union, fighting immigration, and trying to follow in the footsteps of the beloved Joan of Arc. So anyway, that is it for the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.